Welcome to Dark Night Tales. In 1855, on the cobblestone streets of Richmond, Virginia, a slave auction stopped men mid-breath because standing on the block was a man whose beauty unsettled everyone who saw him. Tonight's story isn't just about appearance, it's about power, obsession, fear, and a mystery history never fully explained. By 1855, Richmond, Virginia was not just a southern city, it was the beating heart of the American slave trade. Second only to New Orleans, Richmond's slave markets fed plantations across the deep South, turning human lives into commodities priced, cataloged, and shipped like cargo. Along streets like Shockoe Bottom, auction houses operated in plain sight, their iron balconies overlooking crowds of buyers, traders, and onlookers who treated these events as both business and spectacle. Slave auctions were scheduled events advertised in newspapers days in advance. Men, women, and children were displayed on raised platforms, their bodies inspected under harsh daylight. Teeth were checked, muscles squeezed, scars noted, and skin tone openly discussed. Strength meant profit, youth meant longevity. Any perceived flaw meant a reduced price or public humiliation. For the enslaved, this was a moment of terror. Families were separated with a gesture, futures erased with the strike of a hammer. What made Richmond in 1855 especially chilling was how normalized this cruelty had become. Churches stood only blocks away. Courthouses heard testimony about property disputes involving human beings. Children watched these auctions and learned early that ownership of people was law. In this environment, something as simple and as dangerous as beauty could transform an auction into a spectacle bordering on obsession. When rumors spread that an unusually handsome male slave would be placed on the block, the market reacted instantly. Traders anticipated higher profits. Spectators came not to buy, but to see. In a system obsessed with control, perfection in an enslaved body was unsettling. It blurred the line between possession and envy. And in Richmond's crowded markets of 1855, that tension was about to erupt into legend. In 1855, Richmond, Virginia stood as one of the darkest engines of the American slave economy. Often called the slave capital of the Upper South, Richmond functioned as a massive redistribution hub where enslaved people from Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas were sold and sent farther south to cotton and sugar plantations. Entire neighborhoods, especially Shockoe Bottom, were built around this trade, their warehouses, jails, and auction houses operating almost daily. The markets were brutally efficient. Auction houses such as Lumpkin's Jail, known chillingly as the Devil's Half-Acre, held enslaved men and women in cramped cells before public sale. Days before an auction, notices were printed in local newspapers announcing the number, age, sex, and physical condition of the enslaved. These ads stripped people of names and histories, reducing them to measurements and monetary potential. On auction days, crowds gathered early. Buyers arrived with ledgers and cash, traders whispered valuations. Curious spectators treated the event like theater. Enslaved individuals were forced onto platforms where their bodies were openly examined. Muscles were flexed on command. Scars from whipping were hidden or explained away. Teeth were pried open. Skin tone, posture, and facial features were discussed aloud, sometimes with mocking fascination. The process was dehumanizing by design, meant to break spirit and assert dominance. Richmond's slave markets were also uniquely public. Unlike rural plantation sales, these auctions occurred in the center of the city. Churches rang bells nearby. Horse-drawn carriages passed within feet of the auction blocks. Respectable citizens, including women and children, could observe the buying and selling of human beings as part of ordinary life. This visibility normalized cruelty and embedded it deeply into the city's identity. Within this world, physical appearance carried dangerous weight. A strong body promised labor. A healthy look meant profit. But exceptional beauty, especially in an enslaved man, was rare and unsettling. It provoked envy, desire, and fear among white buyers who believed racial hierarchy must be visually reinforced. When whispers spread that an enslaved man of extraordinary beauty would soon be auctioned in Richmond, the market stirred with anticipation and unease. By 1855, Richmond was not just selling bodies, it was selling myths about race, power, and control. And in a place built on the idea that enslaved people were less than human, the presence of someone whose appearance defied those beliefs threatened the very logic of the system itself. The auction was announced like any other, dry language in local papers, a date, a location, a list of property to be sold. But in the days leading up to it, something changed. Whispers began moving through Richmond's taverns, counting houses, and trading offices. This would not be an ordinary sale. Those who claimed to have seen the man in holding spoke in lowered voices, describing a figure so striking that it disrupted the usual balance of power at the auction block. On the morning of the sale, the crowd gathered earlier than usual. Traders arrived not just to bid, but to measure the reaction. Wealthy planters came from surrounding counties, some drawn by rumor rather than necessity. Even men with no intention of buying pushed into the crowd, curious to witness what newspapers would later call most uncommon specimen. Women watched from balconies and carriage seats, their interest officially unacknowledged but impossible to miss. When the enslaved men were first brought out, the mood was routine. Until he appeared, conversations faltered. Lotta died mid-sentence. The auctioneer paused longer than normal, allowing the crowd to absorb the sight before him. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable, and his appearance so far removed from the caricatures used to justify slavery that it unsettled even seasoned traders. Instead of the usual crude commentary, there was hesitation. Bidders studied not just his body, but one another's reactions. Desire clashed with discomfort. Admiration quickly curdled into suspicion. Some men questioned whether displaying him publicly was wise. Others worried his presence would disrupt the auction's tone, or worse, invite dangerous thoughts among the enslaved watching nearby. The bidding itself became tense. Prices climbed faster than expected, driven not only by perceived value, but by competition fueled by ego. Owning such a man became a symbol of dominance, a way to reassert control over something that felt threateningly exceptional. Each raised bid carried an unspoken message. I can possess what unsettles you. Long after the gavel fell, the crowd lingered. People argued over what they had seen, offering conflicting descriptions that only deepened the mystery. Some insisted his beauty was exaggerated. Others swore it was something they would never forget. What was clear is that this auction broke the unspoken rules of Richmond's slave market. It was no longer just commerce. It was a moment when the system revealed its fear of the very humanity it tried so hard to deny. The language used to describe him was revealing and disturbing. Witnesses struggled to reconcile what they saw with the beliefs they had been taught all their lives. Newspapers, private letters, and word-of-mouth accounts avoided direct praise, instead reaching for coded phrases like unusual symmetry, remarkably fine features, and a countenance ill-suited for his station. To acknowledge beauty openly would have challenged the racial hierarchy slavery depended on, so observers framed it as something unnatural. His face, according to several accounts, did not match the exaggerated stereotypes common in slave advertisements. His nose was described as straight, his jaw defined, his eyes intense and focused rather than downcast. His skin tone, neither too dark nor too light, by the era's warped standards, was mentioned repeatedly, as if writers were trying to place him within a category that did not quite exist. Even his hair, often a point of mockery in racist descriptions, was noted for its thickness and careful grooming. Most unsettling to white observers was his composure. He did not avert his gaze. He did not fidget or slump. His posture suggested restraint rather than submission, dignity rather than defiance. This calm presence made his appearance more threatening. Beauty in an enslaved woman was often fetishized, but in a man it disrupted ideas of dominance, masculinity, and racial superiority all at once. Some spectators claimed his looks were too refined, implying mixed ancestry, foreign blood, or even deliberate deception. Others whispered that such beauty could not exist without danger, that it would invite sympathy, provoke desire, or inspire resistance. In a society that relied on visual cues to justify ownership, his appearance blurred lines that were meant to stay rigid. The word, unnatural, became a shield. It allowed observers to distance themselves from the uncomfortable truth that beauty, dignity, and humanity could not be contained by chains. By labeling him an anomaly, they preserved the illusion that he was an exception, not proof that the system itself was built on a lie. And in doing so, they ensured that his face would be remembered not just for how it looked, but for how deeply it unsettled those who saw it. The reaction from white bidders and spectators was immediate and deeply divided. At first, there was silence. Not the usual murmuring of prices and assessments, but a heavy pause that spread through the crowd as eyes fixed on the man standing on the block. For seasoned traders, this hesitation was alarming. Auctions thrived on routine and detachment, and this moment had neither. Some men reacted with open fascination. Their stares lingered too long, quickly masked by forced coughs or sharp turns of the head. Admiration was there, but it had to be hidden, buried beneath the language of ownership and valuation. Compliments were reframed as good breeding or fine stock, terms that reduced unease by restoring a sense of control. To desire was dangerous, to possess was acceptable. Others responded with visible hostility. Brows tightened, jaws clenched. A few scoffed loudly, dismissing the rumors as exaggeration. This defensiveness betrayed fear, not of the man himself, but of what he represented. His presence challenged the unspoken rule that enslaved men must appear visibly inferior. If he did not look conquered, then perhaps conquest itself was incomplete. Among planters, the tension took on a competitive edge. Owning him became less about labor and more about dominance. Bidding wars flared not from practical need, but from wounded pride. Each raised bid felt like an attempt to reclaim authority, to prove that beauty, even unsettling beauty, could still be bought, branded, and controlled. Spectators without money watched with a different intensity. Some were drawn by curiosity, others by something closer to discomfort. Conversations after the auction revealed contradictions. Men who insisted his beauty was irrelevant, yet could describe his face in exact detail. Men who claimed indifference, yet returned again and again to watch him. What united all these reactions was unease. The auction had forced white Richmond to confront a truth it worked hard to suppress, that the humanity of the enslaved could not be erased by law or custom. In that moment, standing beneath the auctioneer's voice, the man on the block did something no protest could do. He made the system feel fragile. At the heart of the auction was a dangerous contradiction, desire pulling in one direction, fear in the other. The man's appearance sparked fascination that many in the crowd did not want to admit, even to themselves. Desire, in this context, was not only physical, it was rooted in admiration, curiosity, and the unsettling recognition of shared humanity. And that recognition was exactly what made it terrifying. In slave markets, desire had rules. Enslaved women were routinely objectified and spoken about openly, their beauty twisted into justification for abuse. But an enslaved man who inspired admiration disrupted the racial and gender hierarchies that upheld slavery. His presence threatened white masculinity, which relied on the idea that black men were physically powerful but aesthetically inferior, meant only for labor, not for envy. This created fear. Fear that white women might look too long. Fear that other enslaved people might see him and feel pride instead of submission. Fear that beauty could become influence, and influence could become resistance. Some bidders worried aloud that such a man would be hard to manage, not because of strength, but because his mere existence challenged the social order. The auctioneer sensed it too. His voice grew sharper, more transactional, as if speed could smother discomfort. He emphasized obedience, health, and work capacity, anything to redirect attention away from appearance. But the crowd could not unsee what stood before them. Bidding escalated not because buyers wanted him, but because they needed to prove something, to themselves and to one another. Ownership became a way to neutralize desire, to convert fascination into control. To buy him was to declare that even the most unsettling form of beauty could be reduced to property. Yet fear lingered. Long after the sale, whispers followed his name. Men questioned whether he should have been displayed at all. In that uneasy space between attraction and terror, the auction revealed a deeper truth. Slavery was not just sustained by violence, but by the constant fear that its lies could be undone by something as simple and as powerful as being seen. Almost immediately, the question began to circulate. Where did he come from? In a system obsessed with classification, his appearance refused to fit neatly into the categories Richmond relied upon. Traders and spectators searched for an explanation that would make him less threatening, and so rumors bloomed, each one revealing more about the fears of the society spreading them than about the man himself. Some claimed he was of mixed ancestry, insisting that such beauty could only be explained by foreign blood. This rumor allowed white observers to preserve the myth of racial superiority by suggesting his features were borrowed, not inherent. Others went further, whispering that he was the child of a white planter and an enslaved woman, an unspoken truth common enough to be believable, yet rarely acknowledged openly. In this version, his appearance became evidence of hidden sins rather than a challenge to ideology. Another story placed his origins outside America entirely. A few insisted he had been brought from the Caribbean or South America, regions imagined as exotic and dangerous. Labeling him foreign made him easier to fear, easier to control, and easier to dismiss as an anomaly. If he did not belong to Virginia's enslaved population, then he did not reflect a failure of the system, just an odd exception. There were darker rumors, too. Some claimed his beauty had been deliberately cultivated, that enslavers had groomed and protected him for years in anticipation of a high-price sale. Others whispered that previous owners had kept him hidden, afraid that his presence might provoke unrest or unwanted attention. No version of the story could be confirmed, and official records offered nothing but silence. What united these rumors was the refusal to accept a simple truth, that he was born as he stood, human, dignified, and visually undeniable. By inventing complex origins, white Richmond shielded itself from confronting what his existence implied. The mystery of where he came from became a distraction, a way to talk around the man without ever truly seeing him. And in that swirl of speculation, his real history, his family, his childhood, his name, slipped quietly out of reach. When the bidding began, experienced traders expected a premium, but no one anticipated just how far the price would climb. From the first call, offers jumped in unusually large increments, skipping the cautious steps that typically governed slave auctions. The auctioneer barely had time to repeat numbers before another voice cut in, sharper and louder, driven less by logic than by pride. His valuation quickly surpassed that of other prime male laborers of the same age and build. This was not about strength alone. Planters paid high prices for muscle every day, but this was different. The man on the block had become a symbol. Owning him meant possessing something rare, something others wanted but could not have. In Richmond's competitive trading culture, rarity meant prestige. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the price rose. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that the market had gone mad. Others watched with narrowed eyes, recalculating what such a purchase would signal back home. To bring him to a plantation was to display wealth, power, and dominance all at once, proof that even the most unsettling beauty could be bought. When the final bid was accepted, it landed well above the expected range for the year. The hammer fell, sealing a transaction that would be discussed long after the crowd dispersed. The amount itself became part of the legend, retold in taverns and offices with a mix of admiration and unease. Yet the shocking price carried an irony. The more he was valued in dollars, the more invisible he became as a person. The sale reduced a life, already stripped of freedom, to a number that satisfied egos and accounts. And in paying so much to own him, the market revealed its deepest fear, that without chains, without money changing hands, he might have been worth something no system could control. In the antebellum South, the value of enslaved people was measured not just in strength, skill, or age, but in appearance. Owners and traders meticulously observed every physical detail, believing that outward beauty reflected both health and breeding. In this environment, the man who appeared at Richmond's auction in 1855 became an object of obsession, not just for his market value, but for what he represented: a body that unsettled, intrigued, and fascinated in equal measure. Enslavers studied his features with a near scientific intensity. They noted the symmetry of his face, the depth and clarity of his eyes, the set of his jaw. Even the way he carried himself, poised, steady, and unflinching, was scrutinized as if every gesture could reveal obedience, temperament, or hidden strength. Beauty, in this context, was a double-edged sword. It suggested desirability, which could drive profit, but it also implied autonomy, something the institution of slavery sought to suppress. This obsession went beyond mere speculation. Records from Richmond traders indicate that certain enslaved men were deliberately groomed or selectively displayed to maximize sale prices. Clothing, cleanliness, and posture were manipulated. Even minor scars or blemishes were hidden or excused. In the case of this remarkable man, the crowd and bidders seemed almost hypnotized, their attention drawn repeatedly to his face, his hands, his stance. His aesthetic presence became as central to the auction as the actual labor he could perform. The fixation also reflected broader anxieties of the time. White owners worried that beauty in a black man could inspire jealousy, desire, or even rebellion. It challenged racial hierarchies by suggesting traits, strength, elegance, dignity that society claimed belonged exclusively to white men. Obsession with his appearance was therefore not just about commerce. It was a defensive mechanism, an attempt to reclaim control over something fundamentally threatening. In the end, his beauty became a kind of currency in itself. It elevated his price, captured attention, and cemented the story in memory long after the auction ended. But it also revealed the fragility of a system that needed to categorize, own, and diminish people, and feared most the ones whose humanity was too vivid to ignore. In 1855 Richmond, the very notion of beauty was entwined with deeply entrenched racial myths. White society had long created rigid stereotypes to justify slavery. Black men were depicted as brutish, women as hypersexualized, and both as inherently inferior in intellect, morality, and aesthetics. These false narratives were carefully maintained through newspapers, pamphlets, literature, and even visual art. They provided the foundation for a system that relied on dehumanization. When the most strikingly beautiful male slave appeared on the auction block, he shattered these illusions. His facial features, sharp jawline, straight nose, and expressive eyes, defied the grotesque caricatures that white Richmond had normalized. His physique, both strong and graceful, did not fit the narrow mold of the idealized laborer or the dangerous brute. For a society invested in categorizing black men as mere property, such beauty was not simply unusual, it was threatening. Observers reacted in ways that revealed the fragility of these racial myths. Some attempted to explain away his appearance through ancestry speculation, claiming mixed bloodlines or foreign origins. Others labeled his beauty as unnatural, framing it as an anomaly rather than a truth that contradicted their ideology. These rationalizations were a defense mechanism, allowing people to preserve their beliefs about racial hierarchy, while still acknowledging what they saw. Moreover, his beauty disrupted established social codes. Admiration, even fleeting, created tension between fear and desire, emotions white society felt compelled to suppress publicly. The very act of looking at him became politically charged. It challenged the notion that black men were only laborers and that their bodies could be controlled without question. Ultimately, his presence on the auction block exposed a deep contradiction. While the system of slavery relied on dehumanizing black people, the natural humanity and dignity of this man could not be hidden. Beauty, in this case, became a silent rebellion. It revealed the lies underpinning racial myths, unsettled observers, and ensured that this moment in Richmond's history would not be easily forgotten. One of the most haunting aspects of this story is the absence of clear, official records documenting what happened to the man after the auction. In a city like Richmond, where meticulous ledgers tracked every transaction, the disappearance of detailed accounts is striking. Newspapers, legal documents, and plantation records make no mention of his fate beyond the sale. It's as if the system that meticulously commodified human lives deliberately chose to erase him from history, or was unable to fully capture someone who defied its assumptions. This silence is particularly unsettling because auctions were typically well-documented events. Bidders' names, final prices, ages, and even minor injuries were often recorded. Yet in this case, the most striking male slave Richmond had ever seen vanishes into obscurity almost immediately after the gavel falls. Historians who later tried to trace his path find only fragmented whispers, letters mentioning a fine boy, rumors of a plantation where he was well cared for, and conflicting accounts that cannot be reconciled. The lack of records reflects more than mere bureaucratic oversight. It underscores how unusual his presence was. His beauty, dignity, and composure challenged the social norms and ideological constructs underpinning slavery. By not documenting him thoroughly, Richmond's elite could avoid admitting that their system had failed to categorize or contain him fully. In a sense, erasure became a tool of control, silencing what the enslaved could never be allowed to symbolize publicly: humanity, power, and individuality. Moreover, the silence amplifies the mystery surrounding him. While other enslaved people are reduced to statistics, this man's story exists largely through rumor, gossip, and rare eyewitness accounts. Every absent record leaves a gap, forcing later generations to question what was seen, heard, and feared that day. The void in official documentation transforms him from merely a figure at an auction into a legend, haunting both history and imagination. One of the most intriguing and confounding aspects of this story lies in the eyewitness accounts, which often conflict dramatically. Unlike official records, these personal recollections provide vivid, emotional, and sometimes sensationalized impressions of the man on the auction block. Yet the details rarely align, leaving historians and storytellers to piece together fragments of a life that is part fact, part legend. Some observers emphasized his beauty, describing him in near mythical terms. They spoke of features so striking that they seemed almost sculpted, eyes that held intelligence and depth, and posture that conveyed dignity rather than submission. According to these accounts, even hardened traders and planters found themselves unnerved, unsure whether to admire or suppress their fascination. These descriptions became the foundation for the enduring legend of the Richmond Enigma. Other witnesses, however, painted a very different picture. Some emphasized his strength over his appearance, claiming he looked like any other prime male laborer, or even downplaying his facial features as exaggerated by rumor. A few suggested that stories of his beauty were blown out of proportion by local gossip, amplified by the very human desire to talk about something extraordinary. Still others focused on his behavior and composure, describing a calm, almost defiant manner that stood in stark contrast to the typical demeanor expected of enslaved men in public sales. His gaze, steady and measured, seemed to challenge the crowd, forcing people to confront a sense of humanity they were conditioned to ignore. These behavioral observations sometimes clashed with purely physical descriptions, creating further contradictions in the record. The conflict between accounts reflects the biases, fears, and desires of the witnesses themselves. Those who wanted to justify their own participation in slavery may have minimized his beauty or poise. Others, unnerved by what they saw, enhanced it in storytelling, turning him into a symbol of disruption and power. Because the testimonies do not converge neatly, the man's image remains enigmatic. Each account offers a partial truth, colored by perception and social context, leaving modern historians and audiences grappling with the tension between myth and reality. This very conflict is what has immortalized him, ensuring that the story of the Richmond Enigma continues to captivate, terrify, and provoke reflection even more than a century and a half later. The auction of Richmond's most strikingly beautiful male slave was not merely a transaction, it was a psychological exercise in dominance and control. For the white bidders, purchasing an enslaved person was about more than labor, it was about asserting absolute power over a human life. Yet in the case of this man, that dynamic became deeply complicated. His extraordinary beauty and composure disrupted the expected balance, forcing buyers to confront feelings they were culturally conditioned to suppress: admiration, envy, and even fear. Ownership in the slave system relied on visual and behavioral cues. The enslaved were expected to appear weak, subservient, and inferior, signaling that control was natural and justified. But this man's presence unsettled those assumptions. To own him was not just to gain a worker, it was to claim mastery over something exceptional, a body and spirit that seemed almost beyond domination. That tension heightened the psychological stakes of the auction, turning every bid into a statement of ego as much as economic necessity. The bidders' behavior reflected this struggle. Some bid aggressively, seemingly to assert dominance before their peers. I can own him. I can control what frightens you. Others hesitated, intimidated by the awareness that the man's dignity and presence could never truly be erased, no matter how high the price. Even after the sale, the act of ownership could not entirely suppress the unsettling impression he left, a reminder that the enslaved were human, with qualities that could provoke desire, awe, or fear, rather than mere labor and obedience. Enslavers' obsession with maintaining control extended beyond the auction block. Plantation owners often sought to manipulate appearance, behavior, and environment, attempting to mold those they owned into predictable, manageable forms. But with someone whose natural attributes were so remarkable, these attempts could never fully succeed. Every glance, every interaction, became a silent negotiation of power, a reminder that the human spirit could resist total domination, even under the most brutal systems. Ultimately, the psychology of ownership in this case highlights a paradox at the heart of slavery. The system depended on absolute control, yet it consistently confronted individuals whose humanity, dignity, and even beauty could not be contained. In Richmond, in 1855, this paradox played out on the auction block, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who witnessed it. In the context of 1855 Richmond, beauty was not merely an aesthetic quality, it was a source of anxiety, power, and, ultimately, perceived danger. For an enslaved man, being strikingly handsome carried a unique and unsettling weight. Unlike physical strength, which could be measured and utilized for labor, beauty could not be contained, quantified, or fully controlled. It drew attention, stirred emotions, and, most alarmingly for the white spectators, suggested an autonomy that challenged the social order. Observers at the auction described reactions that oscillated between fascination and fear. Some planters and traders were unnerved by how his appearance seemed to command attention without words, as if his mere presence disrupted the expectation of obedience. His composure, combined with his exceptional features, created a tension that the buyers could not easily manage. Admiration in themselves, or in others, threatened the carefully maintained hierarchy. It reminded them that human qualities could exist beyond their control. The threat was not just social or psychological, it was deeply symbolic. Slavery relied on the perception that black men were inherently subordinate, their roles defined by labor and obedience. A man whose beauty suggested refinement, dignity, or individuality risked undermining that narrative. Even rumors of his lineage or intelligence were magnified because they could imply that he was more than the sum of the system's assumptions. Beauty, in this sense, became a potential spark for rebellion, if not overt, then through influence, charisma, or the unsettling acknowledgement of shared humanity. Bidders and spectators coped with this perceived threat in predictable ways, by raising the price to assert dominance, by labeling his appearance as unnatural or exceptional, or by spreading rumors that framed him as an anomaly. These reactions reveal that beauty, when it existed outside the social norms designed to suppress it, could unsettle power structures more effectively than brute force. In essence, his beauty was both a currency and a weapon. It elevated his market value while simultaneously destabilizing the very system that sought to commodify him. The fear he provoked highlights one of the darkest truths of slavery, that human qualities, dignity, intelligence, beauty, were dangerous precisely because they could not be bought, sold, or fully controlled. His presence on the auction block was a silent rebellion, a visual reminder that the enslaved were human beings with the power to unsettle those who claimed mastery over them. One of the most haunting aspects of the Richmond Enigma is how history has largely erased him. Despite the dramatic spectacle of his auction and the intense reactions he provoked, official records, newspapers, and archives provide only fragments of his existence. There is no birth record, No detailed account of his family, no confirmed documentation of where he was sent after the sale. In a system that meticulously recorded the buying and selling of human lives, his disappearance from records is striking and telling. This erasure reflects the uncomfortable truth that he did not fit into the narratives white society wanted to preserve. His extraordinary beauty, composure, and presence challenged the ideology of racial inferiority upon which slavery was built. To document him fully would have forced observers to acknowledge a reality that was socially and psychologically dangerous, that enslaved people could possess dignity, allure, and humanity that could unsettle their owners. By leaving him undocumented, history silently reinforced the lie that such individuals were exceptions to be whispered about, not remembered. The gaps in the historical record also highlight how stories of extraordinary individuals often survive only in rumor, oral tradition, or fleeting eyewitness accounts. Letters, journals, and second-hand reports hint at his existence, yet each account is colored by the observer's biases, fears, and desires. Over time, these fragments coalesced into legend, preserving the emotional impact of his presence, while obscuring the concrete realities of his life. Erasure also underscores a broader pattern in history. The lives of enslaved people were often reduced to numbers, auction prices, and labor value. Those who defied expectations through intelligence, beauty, skill, or resistance were the most likely to vanish from official memory. Their stories survived only through the curiosity and conscience of witnesses willing to note what the system tried to suppress. In this way, the Richmond Enigma's legacy is defined as much by absence as by presence. What we do not know, the details of his childhood, his family, and his later life, speaks as loudly as what we do. His life is a reminder that slavery sought to erase identity, but extraordinary individuals could leave traces that history could not fully contain. The silences, the missing records, and the whispered rumors are as much a part of his story as the auction itself, creating a mystery that continues to haunt us today. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Richmond Enigma is that, after the auction, his story essentially disappears. Unlike many other enslaved people, whose lives were meticulously tracked through bills of sale, plantation records, or family recollections, there is no verified record of what became of him. Did he end up on a distant plantation in the Deep South, subjected to grueling labor and harsh oversight? Was he treated differently because of his beauty, perhaps valued as a special possession? Or did he disappear entirely into obscurity, his existence fading into rumor and memory? No one can say for certain. The unanswered nature of his fate leaves a profound sense of unease. Unlike objects or livestock, this man possessed qualities, beauty, dignity, intelligence, that could not be fully owned or erased. His extraordinary presence made those around him remember him, but history chose not to preserve the details of his life. The very silence about his future amplifies the mystery, making him both a historical figure and a legend. Speculation about his later life runs wild in oral histories and scattered accounts. Some stories suggest he might have been sold repeatedly, moving from owner to owner, admired but constrained. Others hint that he resisted invisibility in small ways, perhaps through defiance, charm, or resilience, though no records survive to confirm such acts. Every attempt to trace him encounters the same obstacle. The systematic dehumanization of slavery erased the individuality of those it sought to control, leaving only fragments to reconstruct. This uncertainty also magnifies the symbolic power of his story. He represents countless enslaved people whose lives were stolen, whose potential was commodified, and whose stories were intentionally left untold. The fact that his fate remains unknown forces modern observers to confront a painful truth. The historical record is incomplete, not because of accident, but because of a system designed to suppress the humanity of those it enslaved. Ultimately, the Richmond Enigma's unresolved fate ensures that his presence continues to haunt the imagination. He is remembered not just for the auction that made him famous, but for what his story reveals about the cruelty, obsession, and fear at the heart of slavery, and for the enduring mystery of a life that history could neither fully capture nor erase.